It was a quiet afternoon when Sarah first sensed something was off. The air in the house seemed thick with tension, a weight that had slowly been building up over the last few months. She walked into the living room, her gaze immediately falling on her stepmother, Evelyn, who was sitting by the window, her fingers gently tapping on the edge of the glass. Her posture was straight, but there was an unmistakable coldness in her eyes, something Sarah couldn't quite place but felt all too clearly. Evelyn had always been a distant figure in Sarah's life. Ever since her father remarried, it was as if a wall had slowly risen between them, one that Sarah couldn't break down no matter how hard she tried. Evelyn wasn't cruel, at least not openly, but there was an unspoken rivalry that hovered between them. Where Sarah's real mother, a warm and nurturing woman, had always been her safe haven, Evelyn seemed to have taken a different approach, a more calculated, distant one. Perhaps it was her role as a stepmother that kept her from fully embracing Sarah, but whatever it was, Sarah always felt like an outsider in her own home. Her father, a man who loved her deeply, always seemed oblivious to the growing gap between his wife and daughter. He'd brush off Sarah's concerns, claiming that Evelyn was just trying to adjust, or that Sarah was overthinking things. But in the silence of their home, the cold glares from Evelyn and the barely contained sighs when Sarah was around told a different story. Sarah knew something was wrong. She could feel it in the way Evelyn would look at her during family dinners, her eyes sharp and calculating, as if she were assessing Sarah for some grand purpose. And then the small, almost imperceptible jabs she would throw, a cutting remark about Sarah's clothes, a disapproving glance when she spoke too much, the subtle but deliberate exclusion from family activities. It was as if Evelyn's every move was aimed at making Sarah feel small, invisible. But why? What was it about Sarah that made Evelyn so uncomfortable, so determined to humiliate her at every turn? What was behind the icy mask Evelyn wore when Sarah was near? And why did it feel like Evelyn had been waiting for the right moment to make her move? The answer, as Sarah would soon find out, was more complex than she could have ever imagined. The twisted plan her stepmother had been carefully plotting all this time was about to unfold in the most unimaginable way. For weeks, Evelyn had been working in the shadows, carefully crafting a plan so subtle, so intricate, that Sarah couldn't even begin to grasp what was happening around her. It started with little things, small, almost insignificant actions that seemed like nothing at first. Evelyn would suggest Sarah do something in front of her father, and when Sarah followed through, the results would somehow turn out wrong. A dinner Sarah prepared would accidentally be overcooked, and Evelyn would point it out in front of everyone, making Sarah feel as if she couldn't do anything right. "It's okay, sweetie. Maybe next time you'll get it right," Evelyn would say, her voice dripping with false sweetness, leaving Sarah feeling humiliated and confused. But that was just the beginning. Evelyn's true strategy was much more elaborate. She began planting rumours, innocent enough on the surface, but damaging when they reached the wrong ears. She would casually mention to family friends how Sarah wasn't really cut out for responsibility, or how her grades weren't as great as she liked to make them out to be. Evelyn made sure these comments were never direct attacks, but whispers that crept through the cracks, reaching the ears of her father and even Sarah's closest friends. Sarah would overhear bits and pieces of these conversations, but each time she tried to defend herself, the words seemed to fade into thin air. Was she imagining it? Was Evelyn really orchestrating this quiet destruction of her self-esteem? Or was she just paranoid? The real breakthrough in Evelyn's plan came one weekend when the family gathered for a barbecue. The backyard was filled with laughter and chatter, but Sarah's stomach churned as she stood on the sidelines, watching Evelyn work her subtle magic. Evelyn had invited a few of Sarah's classmates, and she was playing the role of the perfect hostess, charming, attentive, and almost unnervingly calculating. It was in the middle of a conversation that Evelyn's true strategy became clear. Sarah had been talking to a friend about a school project when Evelyn casually mentioned, loud enough for everyone to hear, how Sarah had been slacking off and barely passing her classes. It wasn't just the words. There was a certain tone in Evelyn's voice, a hint of superiority that made everyone else take notice. Sarah's face flushed, a cold wave of panic sweeping over her as the conversation in the backyard seemed to freeze. The laughter halted for a brief second, and she could see the judgment in her classmates' eyes. How could Evelyn say that? She had worked so hard, and yet here was her stepmother, twisting her accomplishments into weaknesses, making her seem like a failure in front of people who had no idea what was really going on. The worst part? Evelyn's father was watching from the other side of the yard, oblivious to the sharp edge of Evelyn's words. When Sarah tried to confront her afterward, Evelyn brushed it off with a delicate, almost condescending smile. "Oh, darling, you know I only want the best for you. You're just so sensitive," she said, her eyes glinting with hidden malice. But Sarah wasn't so sure anymore. The incidents kept piling up, each one more humiliating than the last. Her father would constantly praise Evelyn for her wisdom in handling family matters, while Sarah felt like an outsider in her own home. She couldn't explain it, but the weight of it all began to take its toll. She started doubting herself, questioning whether her efforts were enough, or if she really was as incapable as Evelyn made her out to be. The whispers of self-doubt began to creep into her mind, and she wondered if maybe it wasn't just the stepmother's actions. Maybe, just maybe, there was something inherently wrong with her. The final straw came a few days later when Sarah was invited to a family dinner at a neighbour's house. Evelyn had made it clear that she wanted Sarah to attend, but when Sarah arrived, it was clear that it wasn't her presence that Evelyn had hoped for, it was her humiliation. Evelyn subtly steered the conversation towards Sarah's recent struggles, mentioning how the family had been worried about Sarah's future. The words were sharp and cutting, as if designed to make Sarah feel small in front of the neighbours. And then, when Sarah nervously tried to explain, Evelyn seized the moment, spinning her words into something foolish. "Don't worry, dear," Evelyn said with a saccharine smile. "We all have our ups and downs, but some of us just can't seem to get out of the slump. Isn't that right, Sarah?" The room fell silent. Every eye was on her, waiting for her to respond. Sarah's throat tightened as her face burned with embarrassment. She wanted to say something, to defend herself, but the words wouldn't come. She was trapped, humiliated, and the weight of Evelyn's quiet control was crushing her. She had spent the last few months questioning her place in this family, trying to convince herself that it was all in her head. But now, in the face of this public shaming, there was no denying it anymore. Evelyn had been slowly, methodically breaking her down, isolating her, planting seeds of doubt, and carefully orchestrating her social and emotional downfall. Sarah had never felt more powerless. The following weeks were a blur of humiliation, confusion, and increasing isolation. Sarah had started to feel like she was losing control of her own life. The whispers behind her back had grown louder, the looks of pity and judgment more frequent. Every time she tried to assert herself, Evelyn's careful manipulation twisted her words, making Sarah feel as though she were overreacting, imagining things. It was all in her head, Evelyn would claim with a soft, patronizing smile. "You're just too sensitive, darling. Maybe you should try to relax a little more." But as the days passed, Sarah began to see through the cracks in Evelyn's polished persona. It wasn't just the awkward silences when she entered a room, the way conversations seemed to die whenever she was near. It was the little details, the way Evelyn always seemed to be one step ahead. Every situation felt like a trap, every compliment laced with venom. Sarah couldn't ignore it anymore. She tried to bring it up to her father, but every time she did, his reaction was the same, dismissive, almost uninterested. "Sarah, you're reading too much into things," he would say, a look of concern crossing his face, but it never seemed to go beyond that. "Evelyn is just trying to help. She's not out to get you, sweetheart. Maybe you just need to make more of an effort to get along." It was a conversation they'd had 1,000 times, and each time, Sarah's heart sank a little more. Her father didn't see it. No one did. Her friends, the few she still had contact with, had started to drift away as well. There was something about Evelyn's quiet, subtle influence that made them uncomfortable, even when Sarah had no idea why. It was as if Evelyn's presence cast a shadow over everything Sarah touched, distorting reality and forcing others to take her side without question. One afternoon, Sarah had had enough. She waited for Evelyn to be alone in the kitchen and confronted her, her voice shaking with frustration. "Why are you doing this to me?" she asked, her words escaping in a rush. "What did I ever do to deserve this? Every time I turn around, you're making me look stupid, like I'm some kind of failure." Evelyn turned slowly, her expression unreadable. There was a moment of silence before she spoke, her voice soft, almost pitying. "Sweetheart, I'm only trying to help you become a better version of yourself. Maybe if you weren't so defensive all the time, you would see that." But there it was again, that cold tone behind her words. Sarah's chest tightened as Evelyn continued, speaking as if Sarah were the one causing all the problems. "You're just so negative. You think everyone's out to get you when really all I'm doing is trying to help. But if you want to keep playing the victim, that's your choice." Sarah felt the weight of Evelyn's words press down on her. She didn't have an answer to that. No way to explain that it wasn't just in her head, that Evelyn really was out to break her. She could feel her confidence slipping, just as it always did when Evelyn was around. How had it come to this? But Evelyn wasn't done. "I don't know what you're expecting from me, Sarah. But frankly, I don't think your father's going to be very happy when he finds out about your little temper tantrums." And just like that, the seed of doubt was planted once again. Maybe she was overreacting. Maybe everything really was her fault. Was she truly the problem? The weeks leading up to the family gathering at her aunt's house felt like a countdown to disaster. Sarah's father was excited, eager to show off his happy family to relatives they hadn't seen in years. But for Sarah, it was nothing more than a ticking time bomb. She knew Evelyn had been building up to something. The way Evelyn had been extra helpful in the weeks before, pushing Sarah to be a little more outgoing and not to embarrass the family in front of their relatives, made her stomach turn. Sarah felt like Evelyn was setting her up for a grand performance, and she was going to be the punchline. The day of the event, the tension was palpable. Sarah arrived at her aunt's house feeling sick to her stomach. As the evening wore on, the conversation flowed smoothly, but every time Sarah spoke, Evelyn found a way to redirect it, making her seem awkward or out of place. When Sarah made a comment about her recent school project, Evelyn interjected, "Oh, sweetheart, I'm sure it's great, but maybe you should have worked a little harder. People really notice those little things, you know." The subtle jabs continued. At one point, Evelyn turned to a family friend and casually remarked, "Sarah's been struggling with her grades recently. It's a bit of a shame, really. I always thought she had more potential than that." It felt like a punch in the gut. Her face flushed with embarrassment as every eye in the room seemed to fall on her, judging her, silently questioning her worth. But it wasn't just the words. It was the way Evelyn said them, with that practiced tone of concern, that made Sarah feel so utterly small. And then it happened. Evelyn orchestrated the ultimate humiliation. During dinner, Evelyn casually suggested that Sarah give a little toast, something light-hearted to break the ice. At first, Sarah hesitated. She wasn't one for public speaking, especially in front of relatives she barely knew. But Evelyn encouraged her, a smile on her face as she gently pushed Sarah into the spotlight. When Sarah stood up, the room grew quiet, all eyes on her. She opened her mouth to speak, but the words wouldn't come. Her heart raced, her palms sweaty. She could feel her throat closing, the anxiety rising. What was she supposed to say? Evelyn, ever the supportive stepmother, leaned in and whispered just loud enough for others to hear, "Don't worry, dear, just speak from the heart." I'm sure you've got something really interesting to say. The words, coming from Evelyn, felt like a mockery. Her voice was too sweet, her encouragement too pointed. Sarah could feel the laughter simmering beneath the surface, the expectation of failure hanging in the air. When Sarah faltered and stumbled over her words, Evelyn's face lit up with a small, knowing smile. It was the final nail in the coffin. The quiet whispers that followed made Sarah want to vanish. She was utterly humiliated, exposed and alone in the sea of people who hadn't even bothered to ask what had been happening behind the scenes. But just when Sarah thought she couldn't sink any lower, something unexpected happened. She overheard a conversation between her aunt and Evelyn. Her aunt, who had always been kind to Sarah, was speaking in hushed tones with Evelyn. "You know, I can't help but notice how controlling you've been lately. Sarah used to be so confident, but now she looks like a shadow of herself. Are you sure you're not pushing her too hard?" Evelyn's response was sharp, but it was the way she said it that made Sarah's heart skip. "I'm just trying to make her better. She's so difficult. She doesn't understand how much I'm trying to help her." It was there. The truth. Evelyn wasn't just trying to help her. She was trying to break her. All the subtle manipulation, the whispers, the sabotage. It was all part of some twisted game to make Sarah feel worthless, to make her bend to Evelyn's will. But in that moment, everything clicked into place. Evelyn's insecurities, her jealousy, her need for control. It was all there, woven into her actions. Sarah wasn't the problem. Evelyn was. And now that Sarah understood her stepmother's game, she was ready to fight back. The moment Sarah overheard Evelyn's conversation with her aunt, everything changed. The pieces of the puzzle, once scattered and confusing, suddenly clicked into place. Evelyn's behaviour, the subtle digs, the manipulation, the coldness, wasn't just a random series of actions. It was part of a deeper, more personal struggle. But what had driven her to do this? And why had she targeted Sarah, the very person she should have been supporting? Sarah couldn't sleep that night. She lay awake in her room, replaying the conversation she had overheard. Evelyn had been trying to break her down, yes, but the truth of it all hit her like a ton of bricks. Evelyn wasn't just a malicious stepmother out to make her life miserable. Evelyn was afraid of losing control, afraid of being insignificant, of not being enough. It was as if Sarah had unknowingly become the target of Evelyn's own unresolved insecurities, fears, and brokenness. The next morning, as the weight of the revelation settled in, Sarah found herself unable to look at Evelyn the same way. She couldn't just ignore what she'd learned. There was a story behind Evelyn's actions, a past that Sarah had never considered before. For all the power and manipulation Evelyn had displayed, there had to be something more, something that had shaped the woman who now stood in her way. And as much as Sarah had been humiliated, as much as Evelyn had made her feel small, she realized that this was the key to turning everything around. Determined to get to the bottom of it, Sarah confronted Evelyn that very afternoon. Her heart raced, her mind swirling with a mix of anger, sadness, and a strange sense of empathy. She had no idea what she was about to uncover, but she needed answers. "Evelyn," Sarah said, her voice steady but tight, "we need to talk." Evelyn looked up from the kitchen counter, her face going still. For a moment, there was a flicker of something. Unease, maybe even fear, in her eyes, but it quickly disappeared behind the usual mask of control. "What is it, darling? Another complaint?" Sarah's pulse quickened. This wasn't going to be easy, but she wasn't backing down. "Number. It's not a complaint. It's about you." Evelyn's eyes narrowed, her smile faltering for the briefest moment. "What about me?" "You're not the person I thought you were," Sarah said, her voice low but firm. "I know what you've been doing. I know what you've been saying. I overheard you talking to Aunt Clara about me." Evelyn's face turned ashen. her breath hitching slightly as if she'd been caught in the middle of something she couldn't explain away. For a moment, there was silence. Then, with a shaky sigh, Evelyn set down the glass she had been holding and turned to face Sarah fully. "You don't understand," Evelyn said quietly, her voice shaking with something Sarah had never heard before: vulnerability. "You never have. You were always the perfect little daughter in your father's eyes, and I was the outsider, the one who had to fight for a place in this family. I didn't want to do this. I never meant to hurt you." Sarah's confusion deepened. She had expected the usual excuses, the manipulation. But this was different. There was no defensiveness in Evelyn's words, just a raw, painful honesty. "What do you mean? You've made my life miserable. You've torn me down every chance you got. How is that fighting for a place in the family?" Evelyn's eyes welled up with tears, and for the first time in a long while, Sarah saw something other than the cold, calculating woman who had been tormenting her. "I thought if I made you feel worthless, if I made you doubt yourself, I could push you out of the way. I could be the one your father relied on, the one he trusted. I wanted him to see me as more than just your stepmother. I wanted him to love me, to need me. But the more I tried, the more you became a threat. I couldn't compete with the perfect image of your mother. She had everything, the love, the connection with him, and I had nothing." Sarah's heart stuttered as she processed Evelyn's words. She had been so focused on her own pain, her own humiliation, that she had never stopped to think about what Evelyn was going through. Sarah had always seen her stepmother as an adversary, someone who was deliberately trying to destroy her. But what if Evelyn's actions were born out of fear? Fear of being rejected, of being overshadowed by Sarah's memory of her mother. "I didn't know," Sarah whispered, her voice breaking. "I didn't know it was like that for you." Evelyn wiped her eyes, taking a step closer. "I didn't want you to know. I didn't want you to see how broken I am. I thought if I made you weak, I could be strong. But all I've done is hurt you. And now I've lost everything." It was as if the ground had shifted beneath Sarah's feet. The woman she had despised, the one who had made her life so miserable, was suddenly standing in front of her, vulnerable and defeated. And as much as Sarah had been torn apart by Evelyn's manipulation, something in her heart softened. She wasn't sure how to feel, angry, betrayed, or pity. But she knew that Evelyn's plan had been a product of her own insecurities, her own need to feel validated in a family that had never fully accepted her. But the truth was, it didn't change everything. Sarah's pain, the humiliation she had endured, was real. And while she could empathize with Evelyn's struggles, she knew she couldn't just let this go. She had to reclaim her power. "Evelyn," Sarah said, her voice now more resolute than it had ever been, "I don't know if we'll ever be able to fix this, but I'm not going to be your scapegoat anymore. You can't make me feel small just because you're afraid of losing your place. And I'm not going to let you tear me down anymore." Evelyn's face crumpled as she nodded, her gaze dropping to the floor. "I don't know how to fix this. You'll have to start by being honest," Sarah said, taking a deep breath. "With me, with Dad, with yourself." There was a long pause, and for the first time, Sarah could see a flicker of something genuine in Evelyn's eyes. It wasn't love, not yet, but it was the beginning of something, a recognition that she had hurt the person who had once been a stranger, but was now, in some strange way, a part of her family. "I'll try," Evelyn whispered, and though Sarah didn't know if things would ever be the same, for the first time in a long time, she felt like she had control. The power was hers now, and she wasn't going to let it slip away. The confrontation was inevitable. Sarah knew that in order to move on, to truly reclaim her power, she had to face Evelyn one last time. The weight of everything, the lies, the manipulation, the humiliation, had been building up inside her for too long. It was time to lay it all out in the open. The moment arrived one afternoon when Sarah found Evelyn alone in the living room. sitting in her usual spot by the window, staring out at the garden. There was something different about her today. She looked weary, almost defeated. Her shoulders slumped, as if the weight of the past few weeks had taken its toll. "Can we talk?" Sarah asked, her voice steady but heavy with emotion. Evelyn didn't turn around immediately, but after a long pause, she nodded. "I suppose we need to." Sarah took a deep breath, gathering her thoughts. This wasn't going to be easy, but it had to be said. "I know what you've been doing, Evelyn," she began. "I know about your plan, everything you've been trying to do to break me. You wanted to make me feel like I wasn't good enough, like I wasn't part of this family. But you were wrong. You were wrong about me, and you were wrong about yourself." Evelyn's body tensed, her fingers gripping the edge of the chair. "I didn't want to hurt you, Sarah. I didn't know how else to make things right." "Make things right?" Sarah repeated incredulously. "You never wanted to make things right. You wanted control. You wanted my father's love, and you thought if you made me the enemy, you'd win. But all you did was hurt both of us." Evelyn's eyes welled up with tears, and for a moment, Sarah saw the broken woman behind the mask. The woman who had been so desperate to fit into a family she felt she didn't belong to. "I never meant to be like this. I thought if I made you feel small, I would finally feel like I mattered to him. But all I did was lose everything and hurt you in the process." Sarah's heart softened, but she held her ground. "I get it now, Evelyn. I understand why you did what you did, but that doesn't make it right. I can't just forget how you made me feel. I can't erase the humiliation, the self-doubt, the isolation." There was a long silence as Evelyn struggled to find the words, her gaze dropping to the floor. Finally, she spoke in a voice barely above a whisper. "I don't know how to fix this. I've messed everything up." Sarah's voice was calm, but there was a strength in it she hadn't had before. "The first step is being honest. With yourself, with me, with Dad. If you want to fix anything, you have to stop hiding behind your insecurities and face them. You have to be real." Evelyn met Sarah's gaze for the first time in weeks, and this time there was no manipulation in her eyes, just raw, unfiltered vulnerability. "I'm sorry, Sarah," she said quietly. "I never wanted to hurt you. I just didn't know how to deal with my own fears." It wasn't a perfect apology, but it was a start. Sarah nodded, her heart still heavy, but she knew that this moment, this conversation, was a turning point. Evelyn wasn't going to change overnight, but at least now she understood the pain she had caused. And that was all Sarah needed. Acknowledgement, honesty, and the beginning of healing. For Sarah, the resolution wasn't about revenge or getting back at Evelyn. It was about finding her own strength in the face of everything she had endured. She realized that while the past couldn't be undone, it had shaped her into someone stronger, someone who wouldn't let anyone define her worth again. Over time, things began to shift within the family. Evelyn didn't become the perfect stepmother overnight, far from it. But there was a noticeable change. She started to make an effort, not just to be perfect in her father's eyes, but to genuinely connect with Sarah. The emotional walls between them didn't crumble in a day, but they began to loosen bit by bit. Sarah, on the other hand, started to rebuild her own confidence. She stopped letting Evelyn's actions dictate how she saw herself. She knew that she was worthy of love and respect, regardless of the relationship she had with her stepmother. The humiliation she had endured no longer held power over her. She had found the strength to rise above it. As for her father, there was no dramatic confrontation, no grand gesture of apology. But there was change in his eyes. He began to see Sarah more clearly, to understand the depth of the struggles she had faced. He didn't fully grasp everything, but he was trying, and that was enough for Sarah. For the first time, it felt like they were truly a family. Not perfect, not without their issues, but real. Looking back on everything, Sarah realized just how much she had learned throughout this ordeal. The humiliation, The isolation, the constant battle with her stepmother, it had all been part of a painful yet transformative journey. She had learned that her worth wasn't tied to the opinions of others. She had learned the value of standing up for herself, of not allowing others to dictate her story. But perhaps the most important lesson was that everyone, even Evelyn, carried their own pain. Evelyn's actions had been driven by fear and insecurity, and while that didn't excuse her behaviour, it helped Sarah understand her better. The woman who had once seemed like her greatest adversary was, in many ways, a victim of her own struggles. As Sarah moved forward, she knew that healing would take time, but she was no longer the broken girl she had been. She was stronger, wiser, and more self-assured. She had learned that growth often came from the most difficult experiences, and that sometimes the best way to deal with toxic people was to stop letting them control your narrative. Evelyn's fate remained uncertain. She wasn't the villain, but neither was she the heroine of the story. She had a long road ahead of her, one that would require facing her own demons. But Sarah had learned to let go of the idea that she needed to fix everything. She had done the work to heal herself, and that was enough. In the end, Sarah found peace, not just with her stepmother, but with herself. And that peace, she realized, was something no one could take away.